I want to go to the word of the Lord today, Exodus chapter 35, starting with verse 30. Now, before we begin, I'd like to give us a little context on the events that were taking place at this time. The people of Israel had just been delivered from Egyptian bondage. They'd went through the Red Sea. They'd been at Mount Sinai. They'd received the law. They went through the era of the golden calf, and all the doubters and the naysayers weren't there anymore. They knew in which direction they were supposed to go, but they needed somebody to stand up and say, here's how we get in contact with God. And God chose two particular men that he hadn't called out before to do this particular task. Verse 30 says, "And Moses said to the children of Israel, See, the Lord hath called by name Bezaleel, the son of Uriah, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah. And he hath filled them with the Spirit of God in wisdom, understanding, knowledge, and in all manner of workmanship." Verse 34 says, "And he hath put in his heart that he may teach both he and Elohab." Both he and Elohab. So he had two particular men that he was going to give this task to. And it's good that God chose these two particular men, because the people had a decision to make earlier, and they chose Aaron. They decided on it. They elected Aaron to be the one to give them what it was they needed to come in contact with God. And that didn't work out very well at all for them. They chose Aaron, and Aaron built the golden calf, and things don't always work out well when politicians are making the decisions. Sometimes the politicians decide they have to make decisions built on consensus. They have to make decisions built on compromise. And when you're dealing with spiritual matters, consensus and compromise just didn't fit into God's plan. But God put in these two particular men, Bezaleel and Elohab, wisdom. They not only had the knowledge and the understanding of how to do it, they had the wisdom of which direction in which they were supposed to go. They were going to build a place for people to come to and get in contact with God, to bring their sacrifices and to hear the word of the Lord. So they built everything that was of beauty, all the gold and the purple and the scarlet and all the beauty that was brought to them. They knew where to put it. They put it on the inside. And when it's on the inside, the outside looked rather plain, rather ordinary. All the extravagance and the beauty was on the inside. And the outside didn't have all that flash and all that blitz and all that bling, as it were. All the beauty was on the inside, and that was the wisdom that these men had. They knew the direction that the Lord wanted to go when nobody else had an answer for it. God completely passed over Moses, passed over Aaron, Miriam, he passed over Caleb, and he passed over Joshua. And he gave it to these two particular men because he put wisdom in somebody that had an answer. He filled them with the Spirit of God in wisdom, and we call that in our language. The Greeks, they called it divine inspiration when God gave them somebody wisdom. In our language, we call it genius. These men had genius. When nobody else knew how to come in contact with God, they had an answer for it. They knew what to do. Wisdom's the direction that your mind's pointing in. It's the judgment that you've been well taught and you know what to do. You know how to make a judgment. Wisdom means judgment. And these men had wise judgment, which is what we need today. We need somebody that has wise judgment. We can place ourselves in a world much like what they did. You can think, what do I do now? Where do we run to? Or should we just freeze in the face of fear, in the face of danger? Well, if you freeze or if you run, that's pretty much what a rabbit would do. And rabbits, for them, it doesn't work out well either way. You can run or you can stand still, and you're going to get eaten either way. That wasn't the direction they wanted to go in. They wanted to go forward because they knew that they had been delivered from Egyptian bondage, just like we have. They went through the waters of deliverance, just like we have. And they had came out on the other side, and they were headed to a city whose builder and whose maker was God, exactly like we have. But they're kind of stuck right now in life. Life has got them not exactly tangled up because they were out there in a place where things didn't really change all that much. The ordinary, day after day, with maybe fear surrounding them on every side. What do we do now? How do we even worship this God? We've got to figure out a different way to worship God because the old ways they're not there anymore. When you take away a person's stability, you take away a person's livelihood, that's a good way to cause a person to have a mental breakdown. It's a good way to cause a person to have a psychological lapse, or we might call it a nervous breakdown. If you wanted to give a person a nervous breakdown, there's several ways that you can go about it. The steps that you would take are well defined. First thing you might want to do if you're going to give somebody a nervous breakdown is you would take away their jobs, just exactly the way these two men had. They had a well-defined job. They had a position while they were there in Egypt. They had knowledge and they had understanding. They just didn't have the wisdom that God put in them just yet. But they knew how to get up and go through the daily routine that they had. They knew what they were supposed to do when they got up in the morning. Their families, their homes, everything was stable. And all of a sudden, that all was gone. It was taken away from them in just a few months. Things were never going to be the same again. And they were in a position where they thought things may never return back to normal again. And that can cause some instability psychologically. The next thing you might want to do if you're going to give a person a nervous breakdown is you would deny them of all activities that give an individual joy. Well, if you're out there in the wilderness, there's not a lot to do day after day. The temperature is 78 degrees average year round, and it rains maybe 8 to 12 inches a year. Even the weather's normal every day, day after day, the drudgery of nothing to do day after day. They weren't exactly confined to their tents, but if you went out of your tent, there's nowhere to go. There's no way you can have a normal life out there. Things are just not going to be ever going to be the same again. Another thing you might want to do to give a person a mental breakdown is you'd inundate them with information, alerts day after day, telling them things are not going to be the same again. And I'm sure that resonated throughout the camp every day. What do we do now? Which direction do we go in? We're never going to be able to go back to Egypt. We're never going to make it to the promised land. There were still doubters there, and we weren't sure exactly what we were going to do, and there wasn't a leader that was able to stand up and get the people's attention. As great as Moses was, he wasn't able to get everybody's attention and say, we're going to follow this direction and follow this path. The leaders of that day weren't able to rally everybody to get their attention going in the right direction. And these men were in that situation. They were ordinary men with ordinary lives that were not going to ever be the same again. They were filled with confusion. Chaos, whether it's one person, whether it's 4 people in a family, or whether it's a nation of several million people, humanity tends to react the same way. And when it happens quickly, the way that it did in Europe back in the 1930s, Germany started what they call the Blitzkrieg, and they rolled across Poland, and they rolled across France, and they rolled across Belgium, and when they would roll into a city, they would just show up overnight, and the next day they were saying, everybody get on the trains, and people became disoriented. You people are separated from each other. Nobody talk. Nobody can come up with an answer to what it is we're supposed to do, and it comes all of a sudden. That can cause a lot of psychological trauma, especially when your leaders are not sure what to do. These men had to face that, but they didn't have time to resist. They didn't have time to come up with an answer just yet. And when we're faced with reality, when we don't know when or if things will ever be the same, when we don't know if we're going to ever get back to normal, we have to have something that's solid enough, a foundation that's firm enough for us to stand on, or we're going to fall all to pieces. And these men didn't fall to pieces because they knew that one of these days we're going to see this promised land. We've been waiting on this since the days of Abraham. Since the days of Abraham, this faith that we've been given, people have believed in this, and we believe it. We've just got to hold on. We've got to keep ourselves occupied until that day comes. We know that a Messiah is going to come one of these days, and he's going to save us. And these men had faith that one day this God was going to lead them to this promised land. You see, our identity is built upon patterns. our lives, our occupations, our social roles, our hobbies, and our relationships. And in this hour, interpersonal relationships play a huge role in what it is that we do from day to day and who we are. And once that's all taken away from us, once that's all become a thing of the past and we don't know if it's ever going to get back to normal, it can cause a lot of instability with our psychology. These two gentlemen in the book of Exodus had a similar situation that you and I have today. It's not identical, but chaos, when it's not of our own doing, it can give us hope. See, because we have the Spirit of God that fills us, we've got wisdom, and we've got knowledge, and we've got understanding. And that's the same faith that these men had, and for 4,000 years, it's the same faith that held these people together and holds us together today. Ernest Becker was a well-known anthropologist during the 1960s and 70s. And he made a statement. He said, "We've known through observation that when a tribe of primitive people come into contact with modern man, they lose their sense that their way of life is even worthwhile. In large numbers, tribes of people will simply lie down beside streams of fish filled with food and die. Food is not the primary nourishment of man." Reminds me of a verse in the Bible where the Lord said that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. This is a true statement. It's been observed, and we know it, that we don't live on just the food that we take in. Our soul cries out for something more. We've got a hunger inside of us. Our spirit needs nourishment. And when even that's taken away from us, it can cause mental problems for us to have to deal with. How am I going to get my spiritual food? How am I going to get my spiritual meat? How am I going to get my spiritual bread? There's no more church. There's no more anything the way it used to be. And we wonder if it's ever going to be the same again. These men didn't let that doubt and that confusion cause them instability. You see, guilt would have been a much easier thing to live with at this time. They could have said, "I've got the knowledge and I've got the understanding, but I'd rather just go back to Egypt. I'd rather take what God's given me and I'd rather hide it like hiding talents underneath a bushel and not let anybody see it, because I don't want to go out there and take any kind of risks at this time. It's not a good time to take risk. I'm going to just hide what God's given me and I'm not going to use it and I'm not going to let anybody else see it. I'm going to live with the guilt of knowing that I've got something to give and not give it." But things like responsibility, like building a tabernacle, the Bible uses the word cunning. It uses the word cunning 3 times in these few scriptures, in these few verses here. And cunning suggests that they may have used not only skill and craft, but they had to use their artistic abilities, something that was intrinsic inside of them. They had to do something that nobody else could do, and they had to lay it out there for the whole world to see, for millions of people to see. They had to take a little bit of their own spirit and put it into this tabernacle. They had to give something that not anybody else could give, and people were going to look at not only for generations to come, but you and I were going to pattern our lives by something that they were given the responsibility to do all those thousands of years ago. Not to mention the burden of freedom that they had. The confusion that they must have dealt with day after day, not knowing what to do, not knowing how to do it, or what to do about it, must have been overwhelming at times. But they didn't let that stop them. They got up and they said, "Whatever it is you want me to do, Lord, give it to me. I'll do it. I'll not only do it, and I'll teach others to do it as well." What other choice did they have? They can't go back. The only way to go is forward. When it comes to following the Lord, there is no going back. I've decided I'm not going back to Egypt. I'm going to go forth to the land of Canaan. I'm going to abide. I'm going to do what God wants me to do while I'm here. History is a vast warning system. And we look in the Bible and we see how other people dealt with these situations, and And what they did, they just held strong until the time came. The Lord was going to make the decisions. They weren't going to follow their own heart. And I know that in these times you're going to hear, we haven't heard just yet, but we're going to hear in the days to come, people are going to stand up and they're going to talk about how that this is prophecy and that this prophecy, this judgment of the Lord is on us, and they're going to make a lot of money doing that. And thing that we have to remember is that we've got our faith, we've got our revelation from God already. We know what He wants us to do. He wants us to repent, be baptized in His name, live a holy and separated life, whatever comes, whatever situations come. It's not a cause for fear, because hope has always been independent of the apparatus of logic. And if we've got this hope that one of these days the Lord's going to come back and He's going to deliver us, whatever our neighbors say, we're not going to follow along with that. Whatever the politicians do, we're not going to follow along with that either. The Lord has put a wisdom inside of our hearts. He's given us knowledge. He's given us understanding. And that's the hope that we have inside of us. This knowledge, this word that He's given us that we can look into. There's no reason for us to have any fear when we've got the hope that this God who created everything has still got everything in His hands. And He's going to give us some direction. And He's going to give us some way out of this situation that we're in. These men in the Scripture, they knew that. They held on to that. And that's what we're holding on to today.